have a child and start going to church full-time without excuses, we managed to make 2 Sunday services before she was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive stage 2 ovarian cancer in which she lost her ability to birth children. We haven't shaken or missed a Sunday service online. If we did, we went back on YouTube and watched it. Now she has a new clean bill of health and her immune system is rebuilding, but the wig she wears is stitched into a hat. Wigs are very expensive, and even one that we could afford isn't very presentable. That being said, the wig that is stitched into a hat is the most suitable and respectable one. I am under the impression that wearing a hat in church is disrespectful while in a holy place and in the presence of God. I am seeking guidance from a pastor as to what is acceptable so I can bring my family back into the congregation. Thank you.
All right, James, good question. I'm so sorry for what your wife is going through, but thankful to hear that God is intervening and helping her. The passage that comes to mind is in 1 Corinthians 11. Let me just turn there. It says, I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is in the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of a man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, obviously cut from Adam's side, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. So first he very, very clearly says in verse 7 here, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is in the image and glory of God. And so this whole idea of a man covering his head with a prayer shawl, it comes out of the 12th century. And so when you go to Jerusalem today and you see Jewish men with their heads covered in a shawl, you never would have seen that in Christ's day. Now, you'll often see paintings and pictures with Christ with a prayer shawl over his head, but you didn't find that in biblical days. Paul's not contradicting that, because the man is deemed to be the head of his wife. And then a few verses later, he says, does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him? It's shameful for him, I think the King James says. In other words, if a man, and I know obviously long hair is somewhat of a relative term depending on the culture, but if a man looks like a woman by his hair, he is really disgracing the role that God has called him in terms of being the head. And so a woman's hair is her glory, Paul will say, and a man is to not have long hair that he looks like a woman. To take on the role of the woman is really to reverse God's order that's affirmed here in verse 3. Now, can a woman wear a hat in church? Sure, there's nothing wrong with it. A woman could have her head covered in church. Now, what part is cultural and what part is dictated as an unchanging principle? You know, like take foot washing. We didn't have a foot washing service during Easter, and we don't do it on a regular basis. In fact, we never do it. Why? Because Jesus was not teaching foot washing. He was teaching servanthood, and a certain kind of servanthood within that whole pericope of serving with clean feet, that is, with a clean heart, because once you've been bathed, you don't need salvation again. But as you walk through the world, sometimes your feet get dirty, and you need to maintain closeness with the Lord. So he teaches a couple of lessons there, but the lesson that they would grasp not hereafter, metatanta, after these things later on, but that they could grasp that night was the teaching of servanthood. And what is clear is that servanthood applies to this day. Foot washing doesn't. So should a woman have her head covered in church? Well, it depends, I suppose, on the culture. When we first started going to the Ukraine in 1998, I could look out over the congregation. I could tell you immediately what women were married and what were single. The married women all had head coverings. And so in respect for that cultural expression, and by the way, that wasn't true just simply in the church. That was true also even amongst the unchurched, because culturally it communicated that you respected your husband as the head. In fact, I don't think it's odd that when a woman gets married, the man does not take his wife's last name. She takes his last name. Why is that? Because she is recognizing, it goes back into biblical roots, that he is the head of the home. And so I think what's important is that, one, there's nothing wrong with wearing a hat. In fact, when I was a young man, even in America, to some degree, this still was being carried on. Women would go to church with either a scarf over their heads up in the Northeast or with a head. In fact, they would have at the Catholic Church a head covering, like a large hat or a scarf. In the Catholic Church, when you walked in, there was a couple things you could do, but one thing is a woman could pick up like a little doily and she put it over her head. Well, that's not really the biblical picture, but still you can see where this came from. And so some things are traditional, some things are cultural, but the eternal principle is that the man is the head of his wife and that she's not to usurp that headship. And neither is he to be arrogant, because every living man came out of a woman, with the exception, of course, of Adam. And there are some cultural expressions, like in a church, or even when you're at a ball game. Very often men will take off their hat when the pledge is being exercised, or even the Star-Spangled Banner. I think that's beginning to change, but that was certainly true even as recently as 20 years ago. And a man wouldn't typically wear a ball cap in church. He would take his hat off. Again, it came back to this whole idea that, he was the head. Now, a lot of things are done out of tradition without understanding the biblical recipe behind them and the biblical origin of certain practices. And that's where the Bible always needs to be taught to the next generation. So for your wife to wear a hat, nothing wrong with it. And for her to gather with the saints, even with a bald head, knowing that she, can't grow hair at this point, there wouldn't be nothing wrong with that. But the fact that she wants to cover her head, that's a good thing. And I think if you found a wig that works, sewn into a hat, more power to you. Gather with the saints, James. Take your wife, and because we need that fellowship in home church and live streaming. Unless a person just physically is unable to attend, that should not be an option for any Christian. Good question. Let's go to the next.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light, 88.7 FM, and online around the world at wagp.net.